today's World Insight with Tian Wei. Tragedies due to trafficking and modern-day slavery, who's to blame and what to do about it. And the quest for quantum supremacy in computers. Has the digital game changer arrived? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live on CGTN from Beijing. We begin our program with an investigation into the deaths of 39 people. An international police hunt is underway right now for those responsible for the deaths of 39 people found in a refrigerated truck in Britain. The 25-year-old driver has been charged with 39 counts of manslaughter. In recent years, though, more cases of human smuggling and illegal immigration have caught global attention. Before our discussion about the root causes, take a look at this first.
The first court appearance. The British police said the driver charged over the death of 39 people whose bodies were found in a lorry in Essex last week has appeared in court, facing charges of manslaughter, human trafficking and money laundering. 4 others have been arrested for their alleged involvement.
We have to gain so much information as we go through to make sure that we don't miss anything. All of that takes time, and it will continue, unfortunately, to take time.
39 bodies, including 8 women and 31 men, were found on October 23 in a refrigerated container traveling to Britain from the Belgian port of Zeebrugge. The bodies in the lorry have been moved to hospital for identification. The case has shocked the UK and beyond. Authorities from China and Vietnam are working with police to identify the victims. Some families in Vietnam believe their relatives were among the 39 found dead. Vietnam's Ministry of Foreign Affairs says there was no official announcement yet on the nationalities of the victims. The Vietnamese Prime Minister has tasked the Foreign Ministry to closely monitor the situation and work with British authorities to confirm the victims' identities. In the past week, this is not the only reported case of human smuggling. 8 migrants, who are all from Afghanistan, including 4 children, have been discovered in another refrigerated truck in France last week. A French newspaper said the smuggled migrants were about to cross over by ferry to Britain. In recent years, smugglers are preying on people desperate for a well-paying job abroad, who ultimately pay the price with their life. What's fueling the trafficking?
With us to make heads or tails of the catastrophes involving global human trafficking. In London, we have Phil Brewer, who is a senior associate at Stop the Traffic. He's a former detective superintendent and head of the Modern Slavery and Kidnap Unit of the Metropolitan Police. Welcome, sir, to our program. Also joining us in London, Jonathan Thomas, a migration researcher at the Social Market Foundation. Last but not least, in Tokyo, Lin Tian-Wai, adjunct research fellow, National University of Singapore. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mr. Brewer, what do you make of the frequent cases apparently regarding human trafficking and a destination like that of the UK?
Well, this is just one of many investigations that will be ongoing. You know, the fact is that these cases are very much, the business model is that someone stays hidden so they can arrive undetected within the UK. So it's not surprising, you know, that unfortunately we've ended up in a situation like we're seeing before us now. But this is unfortunately just the tip of the iceberg.
The tip of the iceberg. How big is the iceberg? That is really the question, Mr. Thomas. After doing research about the area for quite some time, what would you say?
Well, I think we need to go into the terminology a little bit here. People talk about modern slavery, they talk about people trafficking, and they talk about human smuggling. There are people who are being trafficked, which has an element of either they're being moved against their will or they're being misled as to their situation when they arrive. But there are also a lot of people being smuggled, and in that sense, those people are being moved willingly, but they're obviously being assisted to evade immigration controls, and therefore, you know, if you're talking about all of those things together, you're talking about a very large group of people.
Right.
But
it is
you know,
smuggling
there are
really that we
differences.
are
It doesn't mean
talking
that they
about
can't
here
all be
in
moved.
this sense, Mr. Thomas. It's a human smuggling, which is apparently the case this time.
I think that the stories are still coming out, and of course what I was kind of going on to say there is that obviously groups can include, you know, they include different people who can be in different situations, but some of the stories that seem to be emerging from this do suggest that the people who were moving were willing to move and willing to take the risks to move.
Yes.
They were obviously not thinking they were taking the risks that, as it turned out, they were.
However, according to some media accounts, there seems to be interactions between the victim and their families. If those stories were exactly those stories of the victims, of course, the investigation is still going on. But Mr. Lim, we understand some of those knew the kind of situation that they have to go through, and they knew that in the truck, quote unquote, it is a totally different story. But still, we see cases like this keep on piling one after another over the years. And Mr. Lim, what is going on?
I think there are many reasons.
Mr. Lim, please
go
first, and then we go to Mr. Brewer. Thank you. Mr. Lim.
I think we have there are many reasons which account for human smuggling. In the case of Southeast Asia, we have seen the smuggling of Rohingya refugees. The major cause of that kind of situation is the conflict that is taking place in the hometowns of those who are being smuggled. In other cases, it appears to be what one of the previous guests has mentioned, being misled, given false promises to be brought to a better place, and then discovering upon landing in those places that is not what they are promised to be in. Then there are also economic reasons, pressure, social economic pressure to move to somewhere where there are better economic conditions, a promise of a better life. So there are many sort of motivations for people to be either voluntarily participate in human smuggling activities, to pay the smugglers to smuggle them, or to be misled, given promises to be brought to a new place. So there are various reasons that we have seen in the context of Southeast Asia.
Right. Well, for those that are in a much better economy and social situation, it is very hard to imagine why those are voluntarily to be smuggled and pay handsome for that. But there are very different reasons behind many of the different cases. So, Mr. Brewer, from your years of experience dealing with the field, what would you say?
Yeah, the issue is that there is that draw, particularly to the UK, where people, you know, you sort of alluded to this, that, you know, we talk about lifestyle choices, we talk about making life choices in terms of providing a better life for ourselves and for our families, and unfortunately the draw to the UK is the belief that you come here, you can earn far more money for a similar job here in the UK than you will if you're able to find work in your own country. So there's a massive draw, and I think you're right. People don't always understand that. They believe that this is an informed choice, that you know, situations, that the whole sort of way the social network is made up is very similar, but actually it's completely different. And the fact is that someone will decide to travel halfway around the world to take a chance in the UK, probably hearing stories of friends or relatives that may have been exploited, but still making that lifestyle choice in the belief that hopefully they'll be lucky and they'll be able to provide for their families.
But Mr. Brewer, if you think about that, it's been decades that governments, international organizations, civil society has been helping to get that message across, that human smuggling is not the way for you to get out of the place where you were in order to change your life. But still, things like this happening as we speak. Some already known, some still unknown as we speak. So, Mr. Brewer, is there any hope this can be stopped, at least to a certain extent? Mr. Brewer. Sorry,
this is we're talking about money, and you know the people that are responsible for that exploitation will make significant money out of this. So they will do everything they can to ensure that their business model isn't disrupted. In terms of removing those drivers, you know that's a world issue, and to stop someone travelling from, say, from Asia to the UK in the belief that they can earn more money, that the only way you could ever address that is to have a sort of an equal playing field across the world in terms of what people were able to earn, and that's a significant ask.
Certainly that is a very significant ask, but we have to try at least. If you look at the consequences, of course we're talking about human smuggling, but human smuggling usually leads to a lot of different problems in the society, about human trafficking, about modern slavery, just to name a few, forced labor, for example. We've seen there were 5.4 victims of modern slavery for every 1,000 people in the world in 2016, for example, which is one of the consequences of human smuggling, based on the International Labour Organization's report. That means on any given day in 2016, 40 million people were victims, 25 million of them in forced labor and 15 million in forced marriage. It was most prevalent in Africa with 7.6 victims per 1,000 people, followed by Asia and the Pacific at 6.1, then Europe and Central Asia at 3.9. These are just some of the numbers. Once again, it is about rather the human slavery, but it is closely linked to the issue that we talk about today, which is human smuggling. Having said that, though, may I go to you, Mr. Thomas, about that? How much do you think both the legal framework and also the police as well as other entities of a nation state will be able to do together to prevent as much as possible these kinds of quote-unquote human smuggling business model would not work?
Yes, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that there has been great strides forward in the past 20 years in international law, instruments from the United Nations, regional instruments from in Europe and elsewhere, or against people smuggling, against trafficking, against modern slavery.
But
I think, though,
sir, you know, for those of us who do not do the research every day, what are some of these instruments you just talk about? What are the most effective instruments you talk about? Why couldn't that apply in this case or some of the earlier case we have already known?
Well, I think it could apply, and I think that's what people will be tried under. I think you have to question, though, the efficacy of international law to stop these kind of events, given the drivers that the underlying drivers that the other interviewers have talked about. And I think there are other problems with these I suppose transnational legal instruments in practice. One is obviously these chains of smuggling or trafficking span many countries. Again, some of the stories that are coming out from this tragedy show that people travel to different countries and maybe worked a bit there and then moved on later. They didn't just travel to the UK, and that makes it very difficult to deal with from an enforcement perspective. You have obviously need a lot of cooperation between different authorities in different countries. I think the other thing to say about modern slavery is it often hides in plain sight within the country. So if you're in the UK and you're in a nail bar or you're at a car wash, you won't necessarily know that some of the people there may be victims of modern slavery, so it's not so easy to spot. And then the victims themselves don't tend to come forward for various reasons. One is the fear of the people who've trafficked or enslaved them, but also the fact that once they come forward, they may be returned, and they may be returned to situations they don't want to be. So there's lots of complex interactions that mean that, while the law can have a place, it can't really stop what we've seen here.
besides the law, what are some of the other important instruments? Mr. Lim, I know you are more into geopolitics, but certainly doing research about the wealth gap and divide in the world in the Asia-Pacific region. So your thought in this regard?
Well, there is definitely much needed effort for long-term education, particularly for vulnerable groups like women and children and people who live in poverty. Long-term education for them to realize the dangers of human smuggling. Then there is also the need for education in terms of ethical consumption. Many of these people who are smuggled eventually end up as laborers. Some of them are forced laborers to work in agricultural sector or in manufacturing sector. So there's a need to go through the supply chain to find out which part of the supply chain are using forced labor and people who are smuggled, and stop purchasing or consuming products made by these facilities. And also big companies, multinationals, can go through the supply chain and cut off companies that use laborers without ethical concerns or involve human smuggling. So there's a long-term education in the sense of people who are vulnerable, the victims themselves, as well as the corporation and consumers in the world who are using products that could possibly be made using smuggled humans, especially through the supply chain.
Yes, indeed.
And of course, law enforcement is the most important. As the previous speaker has mentioned, many of these syndicates are transnational in nature. So there's a need for greater coordination between the police forces of different countries that are involved. In this most recent case, in Vietnam, for example, they have already arrested 3 women and 1 man. So a lot of intelligence can be gathered from the people who have been arrested, perhaps exchange the information with the Essex police, as well as the police in Ireland, who have been tracking a possible Irish gang that have been involved in this most recent tragedy in human smuggling.
As a detective superintendent of the Metropolitan Police, Mr. Brewer, you really have an authority in this regard to see how much and how well the coordination, whether intelligence sharing and also clues, as well as a police working together among various nations. How does that work?
Well, it actually works certainly within Europe really well. So through Europol, the European police, and through Eurojust, which is the European justice system, there are instruments that we can use, and something called a joint investigation team has worked really well for the time that I was in charge of the Met's Modern Slavery Unit. It means that you effectively work as one team, so you're able to gather evidence from the different countries, and why that is important, as the other interviewees have said, you know, it means that you have that opportunity to, not just to share intelligence, because that is really important, but actually obtain evidence from each other's country. And more importantly, it means it gives us the opportunity to dismantle the whole criminal network, where if we focus, for example, just on one part, say within the UK, I would suggest quite quickly an established organised crime group can redeploy new staff to fill the gap of those that have been arrested, whereby dismantling the whole criminal network, it means that we hopefully will prevent there being further victims, which is obviously the most important part in this.
Just a quick catch up about that. What about the coordination between, let's just say, the European police and such as that of Metropolitan Police and those in Asia or in Africa, where, you know, the sources of these smugglers' income come from? Mr. Brewer.
Yeah, there is, the coordination is not as well played out, but certainly in my experience we've had some really good working relationships with other countries outside of Europe. It's not been as well supported through legislation or through investigative tools, but using organisations such as the National Crime Squad, the National Crime Agency in the UK, with their own officers deployed in important countries from a crime point of view, we are able to work together, and certainly some of those legislative instruments are able to reach outside of the EU to help support joint investigations in non-EU countries as well.
All right. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you, helping us to understand much better about the root causes and probably the most important instruments to be used to prevent things like this to happen. Thank you, really appreciate it. Phil Brewer, Jonathan Thomas, last but not least, Lin Tian Wai. Thank you.